Welcome back to Bold TV. I'm Philip Michael. My guest today is really cool because he warned us all about the influence social media could have on the economy in the book Hype Machine. In addition, there were points in this book that you can say predicted all the chaos that happened with GameStop and a number of other things which we're going to dive into today. Welcome, author and director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, Sinan Aral. How you doing, man?
Very well. Thanks for having me, Philip.
You got it. Now, let's jump right into it. A lot of people laughed at the GameStop thing. Some people were angry that huge companies were knocking down the little guy. But let's talk about how the whole thing even came to happen. What was your take on that? How did this whole mess happen? What happened there? Talk to me.
So it all started on Wall Street Bets, a subreddit of the Reddit platform where people were talking about pricing up the GameStop stock by buying it. They were showing screenshots on social media of their investments in GameStop. And this turned into a big David and Goliath story, right? The little guy takes on the hedge funds. But it turns out that story doesn't really hold a lot of water. A lot of hedge funds made a lot of money. Looks like BlackRock made about $3 billion on it. The former CEO of Chewy was well invested to the tune of 9 million shares before GameStop happened. And he was, talking about why we need to, send the stock higher and so on. So obviously the SEC is investigating what happened there. But really, for me, it is a show of the power of the crowd through social media to move real world outcomes in very dramatic ways. And it also reveals some instability and as well some vulnerability in our economic situation, our equity markets. If you thought that Russia thought it was productive to interfere in our democracy by manipulating social media in the 2016 and 2020 election, imagine what they're thinking about how productive it might be to manipulate social media to affect our economy.
You said something really interesting. Real life situations and dramatic outcomes. What are some other ways where this has manifested and created a grand event in terms of how we're living today? What are some other examples like the GameStop?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about the potential for election violence if the election, the book came out in September.
Yes.
And in chapter 2, I say, listen, if the election outcome is disputed, it could lead to violence in the real world, fed by social media in a number of ways. First, social media enables the sort of incitement and coordination and collaboration of violence. We know that the foiled plot to kidnap and kill the governor of Michigan was coordinated over Facebook. So Facebook and social media messages can legitimize, mobilize, and coordinate acts of violence like we saw in the Capitol on January 6th. And with a steady stream of misinformation can create a lot of disillusionment and anger that will also contribute to those kinds of outcomes. So we're seeing a number of ways in which social media is affecting the real world very starkly.
So how exactly is it that you come to predict these things? What is it that you look at? Is it just did you have a sixth sense when it comes to spotting social media trends? What's your methodology? How do you actually unearth and spot these things?
Philip, I don't consider myself an oracle. In fact, experts have been warning for months, if not years, that these types of outcomes could happen. Because when we study social media, we do these very large-scale studies of the data and the outcomes that happen as a result of the spread of information on social media. And we've seen time and again that social media messages can affect beliefs and behaviors in the real world. We had a study on the cover of Science magazine in 2018 that showed that false news traveled farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied. And we studied 10 years of Twitter data in that study. And so people who study this stuff for a living have been warning that social media can have this type of dramatic impact. So to many of us, it wasn't a surprise at all.
You know, you touched on an interesting point, actually. I think this is more of a debate item than anything else. But there is an economic incentive, is there not, for these different platforms that sell eyeballs? And if you talk about social media, they're not under the same editorial strict guidelines like, let's say, an Associated Press, even though those lines have been blurred also with the advent of native advertising and so forth. And when you say false news or fake news or however you want to phrase it travels faster and is easier to digest for the masses out there, does this create a precursor for a trend of more of that in the future? How do you see that?
Yeah, I love books like Surveillance Capitalism and movies like The Social Dilemma, which was a really hot documentary on Netflix. But
Yep.
my book is really designed to take off where those books and movies leave off, which is to ask, what can we concretely do to fix the social media crisis that we find ourselves in? And in the book, I describe 4 levers.
Okay.
Money, code, norms, and laws. Money is exactly what you're talking about. The business models of the social media platforms that guide the incentives of how advertisers and users behave on the platform. The code is the design of the platforms and the algorithms. The norms are how we as a society choose to adopt the technology, and the laws obviously are regulation, whether it's the antitrust case against Facebook or, as you're describing, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, whether, for example, social media platforms are considered publishers or whether they get other types of shields against civil liability. Those are all questions that I address in the book, all very highly relevant to what happens next in social media.
One more question before we wrap it up. One of the things that everyone is wondering, obviously, is when are we going to go back to some semblance of normalcy? When will the pandemic, what will happen next? What are you seeing there based on the trends that you're spotting? What's your intuition telling you, or your empirical evidence telling you? Where are we going? What's going to happen?
Well, I'm hopeful, but I'm cautiously optimistic. And I'll say, just to go back to sort of a thread that we were on a minute ago about how social proof, when you show screenshots of your GameStop investment, or when you say, hey, I'm going to go to that protest at the Capitol as well, and that mobilizes people in the real world. We just submitted a paper on a very large-scale experimental study that looks at whether or not social proof can be helpful in people getting the vaccine. So it turns out in our study that when you tell people the fraction of other people in their local community that are committed to getting the vaccine, it statistically significantly increases their likelihood of vaccine acceptance. So I think the next major challenge for us is, how do we create messaging that gets Americans vaccinated so that we can get out of this deadly and devastating pandemic? And again, social media is front and center of that type of communication, because social proof motivates people to change their behavior.
So social media is social proof, and we must redirect it in a way that encourages things to come back to normal. Thank you so much for being here, Sinan. A lot of great gems. Best of luck with the book. And man, that was some good stuff. Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Of course, follow Bold TV. Make sure you do that on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Philip Michael, and I'm out of here.